You might believe that the people around you, your colleagues, your voters, even your friends, are driven by loyalty and logic, but 500 years ago, a disgraced diplomat sitting in a muddy farmhouse discovered the uncomfortable biological mechanism that proves we are actually hardwired for betrayal. We need to go back to a very specific moment in history to understand why the world works the way it does today. The history of political philosophy is usually taught as a long, polite conversation between great thinkers, but there is actually a single, traumatic rupture that splits the entire tradition in half. This rupture happened in the early 16th century, and it didn't happen in a university or a palace. It happened on a small, isolated farm in Sant'Andrea, Italy. Imagine a man named Niccolò Machiavelli. He has just been stripped of his office, thrown into prison, and tortured by the Medici regime because they suspected him of conspiracy. He is exiled to his family farm, and his life has collapsed. We actually have a letter he wrote to his friend Francesco Vettori in December 1513 that describes his days. He spends his mornings wrangling with woodcutters and his afternoons playing cards with local innkeepers, arguing over pennies in the mud. He is living through the mundane degradation of rural life, but then evening comes, and this is where the shift happens. He writes that he returns home, sheds his mud-stained clothes, and puts on regal and courtly garments. He enters his study, and in his imagination, he enters the ancient courts of ancient men. He isn't looking for comfort. He is looking for the mechanics of power. He wants to understand the world not as it ought to be, which is what everyone before him had done, but as it actually is. For centuries, people like Aristotle and Cicero had operated under this idea called the mirror for princes. They believed that a ruler's legitimacy came from moral virtue. They believed that deep down, human beings were redeemable through reason. Machiavelli looked at that mirror and shattered it. He realized that if you build a system based on how people should act, you will be destroyed by how they actually act. The result of those nights in his study was a book called The Prince, and it rests on a foundational dark truth about the human animal. His Anthropology is uncompromising. He argues that human beings are not rational actors seeking the common good. We are biological machines driven by universal egoism, fear, and insatiable desire. Now this sounds cynical, and for centuries people dismissed it as the rantings of a bitter man. But here is the twist that keeps us reading him today. Modern science, specifically evolutionary psychology and neuroscience, suggests he was right. Let's look at the specific diagnosis he makes. In chapter 17 of The Prince, he lays out what is essentially a prosecution of humanity. He writes a sentence that I want you to really hear, because it is a systematic categorization of our behavioral drivers. He says, "For this can generally be said of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, simulators and deceivers, avoiders of danger, greedy for gain." He doesn't just throw these words out as insults, they are variables in an equation. Let's break them down because they explain everything from modern corporate layoffs to the collapse of political alliances. First, he says we are ungrateful. In the classical view, if a ruler gave you a gift, you owed him a moral debt. It was a transaction of honor. Machiavelli rejects this. He says the memory of a benefit is fragile. It decays the moment a new desire or a new fear appears. This anticipates what modern psychologists call reciprocal altruism. We are willing to help others, but it is conditional. It is not absolute. Machiavelli warns that if a leader relies on the goodwill he purchased in the past to save him in the future, he is finished. Loyalty that is bought is merited but not secured. Then he calls us fickle or volubili. This implies a fundamental instability in our preferences. We are driven by passions, not reason, so our allegiances shift with the winds of fortune. If a leader relies on the love of the people, he is building on sand because that love depends on their emotional state, which changes without notice. But the most damning accusation, and the one that really connects to modern neuroscience, is that humans are natural simulators and deceivers. Simulation is pretending to have a virtue you don't have. Dissimulation is hiding the intentions you actually do have. Machiavelli implies that the opacity of the human mind, the fact that we can lie effortlessly, is a strategic adaptation. We mask our intentions to avoid punishment. This creates a massive problem for any leader, which is information asymmetry. The courtier smiling at you might be a conspirator. The employee nodding in the meeting might be plotting to leave. You can never take appearances for reality. Next, he says we are avoiders of danger. This is our primary biological drive, self-preservation. Machiavelli notes that when the need is far away, meaning when times are good, citizens will performatively offer their lives for the state. They talk a big game, but this is cheap talk. When the need draws near, when the existential threat is actually at the door, the instinct to avoid danger overrides every social contract. He calls this cowardice, but he recognizes it as a biological imperative. Finally, he says we are greedy for gain. Acquisitiveness is a universal constant. He has this famous, chilling line where he says men forget the death of their father more easily than the loss of their patrimony. We might tolerate losing our liberty, but we will never tolerate losing our property. This gives the prince a very specific boundary. He can be feared, but he must never be hated. And hatred comes primarily from touching the property or the women of the subjects. If you abstain from taking their stuff, you neutralize their greed and you stay safe. So if people are this wretched, ungrateful, fickle, deceitful, cowardly, and greedy, how do you control them? Machiavelli gives us a mechanistic explanation for why fear is superior to love. He argues that love is held together by a chain of obligation, but because we are self-interested, that chain is weak. It is broken on every occasion in which their own self-interest is concerned. Love is voluntary. It requires the subject to actively want to maintain the bond. Fear, on the other hand, is maintained by a dread of punishment which never fails. The dread is external. It is controlled entirely by the prince. Because we are avoiders of danger, the certainty of punishment aligns our self-interest with obedience. He isn't advocating for sadism. He is advocating for the only psychological tether strong enough to hold a fickle species in check. Now, before we get to the modern science that backs this up, there is a paradox we have to solve. A lot of people read The Prince and think Machiavelli was a tyrant, but there is a huge counterargument that he was actually a secret Republican. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that Machiavelli was pretending to give lessons to kings, but he was actually giving great lessons to the people. The idea is that by stripping away the moral pretensions of the ruling class, Machiavelli was exposing the effectual truth that the state is just a structure of force. In his other great work, The Discourses on Livy, he actually praises the wisdom of the multitude. He says a people is wiser and more constant than a prince. So, which is it? Are people ungrateful scum, or are they wise? The reconciliation lies in the role of compulsion. Machiavelli has a maxim: men never behave well unless compelled. In The Prince, he is describing a state of emergency where institutions have collapsed. In that vacuum, human nature runs wild. You need a strong hand to provide the compulsion that laws usually provide. But in the Discourses, he is talking about a republic with strong laws. He compares laws to hunger and poverty. Just as hunger forces naturally lazy men to work, laws force naturally selfish men to be good. The wisdom of the people isn't an intrinsic quality. It is an emergent property of a well-ordered state. When the people face the penalty of law, they run to obey. The underlying nature is always fearful and self-interested, but the structure of containment changes. And here's the really interesting part. Machiavelli argues that princes are actually more prone to these vices than the people. He says that a prince is just a human being whose dark nature is unshackled by consequences. This aligns perfectly with modern psychology, which shows that power disinhibits antisocial traits. Speaking of modern psychology, let's look at how the 21st century validates the 16th. Evolutionary psychologists like Leda Cosmides and John Tooby argue that the human mind is a collection of mechanisms designed to solve adaptive problems. One of the biggest problems for our ancestors was social exchange. If I help you now, will you help me later? In that exchange, there is always an incentive to defect, to take the benefit and not pay the cost. This is the evolutionary equivalent of Machiavelli's ingratitude. An organism that accepts help but doesn't reciprocate gains a survival advantage unless there is a mechanism to stop them. Cosmides and Tooby found that the human brain has a specialized cheater detection module. We are terrible at abstract logic, but we are savants when it comes to spotting a violation of a social contract. Our brains are hardwired to be paranoid about social betrayal. We evolved to expect simulators and deceivers. There is a fascinating case study of a patient known as RM who had damage to his limbic system. He could reason perfectly about safety rules, but he failed completely at social exchange tasks. He physically could not detect when someone was cheating him. This suggests that the ability to navigate the treacherous world Machiavelli describes is a distinct neurological function. A leader without this function, a naive idealist, is biologically handicapped. This brings us to the dark triad. In the 1970s, psychologists developed a scale to measure Machiavellianism as a personality trait. It sits alongside narcissism and psychopathy, but there is a crucial difference between a Machiavellian and a psychopath. Psychopaths are impulsive. They want immediate gratification. Machiavellians are defined by strategic inhibition. They can delay gratification. They can mask their hostility. They can simulate cooperation to achieve a long-term goal. This mirrors Machiavelli's advice perfectly. He warns the prince not to be impulsively cruel because that generates hatred. Instead, he advocates for cruelty well used, calculated, decisive violence executed all at once to secure the state. The successful prince is not a chaotic sadist. He is a Haymock strategist. Now take this template and overlay it onto the modern boardroom. The Italian city-states have been replaced by corporations, but the dynamics are identical. Look at Jack Welch, the legendary CEO of General Electric. He implemented a system called the vitality curve, or rank and yank. Every year, the bottom 10% of employees were fired. This is a quintessential Machiavellian structure. It assumes that men never behave well unless compelled. It creates a permanent existential threat, a dread of punishment. Welch argued that this was actually a form of candor, and that keeping underperformers was ruinous empathy. Did it work? Short-term, yes, it drove efficiency, but critics argue it destroyed psychological safety. Employees started competing against each other instead of the competition. They withheld information, dissimulation, to protect their ranking. It created the exact confusion and disorder Machiavelli warns about when the social fabric dissolves into individual survivalism. We see this archetype in the visionary tyrants of Silicon Valley, too. Steve Jobs had a binary view of people. You were either a god or a bozo. He used fear to drive impossible results. But he balanced that fear with a grandeur of spirit, his product vision. Machiavelli notes that a prince can survive being feared if he also inspires reputation. Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, now X, was a textbook new principality consolidation. He fired the existing leadership, which is Machiavelli's advice to eliminate the old bloodline. He issued an ultimatum for hardcore work, pure compulsion. And he ruled through unpredictable decrees. Even modern management trends like radical candor can be viewed through this lens. Radical candor tells you to challenge directly, but also care personally. A sophisticated Machiavellian might adopt this as a tactic. By simulating personal care, even if they don't feel it, a leader can deliver harsh feedback, cruelty well used, without generating the hatred that causes turnover. It aligns with Machiavelli's advice to seem merciful, faithful, humane, and religious, even if you are not. But there is a flaw in the Machiavellian system, and it is a fatal one. It creates organizational silence. If the prince punishes bad news, the simulators in his court will hide the truth until it is too late. Modern complexity theory tells us that bad news is only good news if it travels fast. If you build a culture of pure fear, you blind yourself. You trigger the avoidance of danger instinct in your team, and they will let you walk off a cliff rather than tell you that you are wrong. So where does this leave us? Is it possible to use these tools ethically? There is a concept called Constructive Machiavellianism. It suggests that the competence of the Machiavellian, the strategic planning, the network building, the ability to read people, can be used for ethical ends. Even a servant leader needs to understand power to protect their team. A leader who is innocent, who is unaware of the wolves, cannot protect the sheep. Machiavelli writes that a man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. To be an ethical leader, you must possess the cheater detection capabilities of the Machiavellian. You have to recognize the ungrateful and fickle nature of stakeholders, not to exploit them, but to survive them. 5 centuries later, Machiavelli's dark truth remains our uncomfortable baseline. It is not that humans are always evil. It is that we are reliably self-interested when the stakes are high. The chain of obligation is weak. In politics, voters are fickle. In business, loyalty is a relic. In our own psychology, we are hardwired to prioritize self-preservation. Machiavelli's ultimate legacy isn't that he taught us how to be evil. It's that he removed the mask. He forces us to confront the human animal not as the rational angel we wish we were, but as the strategic survivor of evolutionary history. Whether you're building a company, a state, or just trying to navigate your own career, you have to build for the reality of what we are, ungrateful, fickle, and greedy, rather than the fantasy of what we ought to be. Civilization is just an artificial construct designed to restrain that entropy. Whether it's through the dread of punishment or the compulsion of laws, the goal is the same: to channel our universal egoism into something stable. Machiavelli didn't invent the darkness inside of us. He merely turned on the lights.